There are soldiers, and there are legends. During World War II, when the fate of freedom was being decided in Europe, there was a man who simply refused to fall. While others retreated, he advanced. While others were evacuated, he returned to the battlefield. Wounded, bleeding, practically destroyed, he kept leading. This is not just a war account. It is the story of a man who faced tanks on foot, who survived the impossible, and who, even when they said he had no more chances, came back to fight again. His name was Matt Urban, and what he did on that battlefield still echoes as one of the greatest examples of courage ever seen in American military history. They told him to stay behind. They said he was too badly wounded, that it was the end of the line, that any further step would mean certain death. The battlefield ahead of him was an open hell, with smoke covering the horizon, enemy machine guns tearing through the air, and men falling one after another. Logic said to retreat. Instinct said to survive. But he did neither. He looked forward and advanced, because in that moment, for those men who were still there, scared, exhausted, losing ground, he was not just an officer. He was the only reason there was still any chance. And while chaos took over everything, while the world seemed to collapse around, there was a single point of stability in the middle of that hell. A man who simply refused to fall. Even before becoming this almost impossible symbol of resistance, he already carried something different. It was not just physical strength, although he had plenty. It was not just military discipline, although it was impeccable. It was a rare combination of controlled aggression, natural leadership, and a presence that made other men believe they could do more than they thought possible. Since he was young, he was not the type to accept limits easily. Competitive, intense, always willing to go beyond expectations, he was building, without realizing it, the foundation of what would later become one of the most impressive stories of World War II. While many were still trying to understand their place in the world, he was already showing clear signs that he would not be just another name among thousands. There was something in him pushing forward, always forward. When the war finally arrived, it did not bring glory. It brought reality, and the reality was brutal. The constant sound of gunfire, the weight of responsibility, the silent fear that everyone carried, even those who never admitted it. As an officer, he did not just have to fight, he had to lead. And that meant making decisions that cost lives, carrying the weight of every man under his command, and still moving forward. But it was exactly there that something began to stand out in a different way. While other officers kept their distance, he placed himself at the front, not out of impulse, but by choice. He understood that in that kind of war, words were not enough. Men did not follow orders, they followed examples, and he chose to be that example. And that is how the first stories began. Small, almost unnoticeable at first. An advance that seemed impossible, but that he led anyway. A position that should have been abandoned, but that he insisted on holding. A moment where everything pointed to defeat, but somehow turned around. And those stories began to spread. First among the men of his unit, then among other companies, and then, slowly, something began to change. His name began to circulate not as a common officer, but as someone who simply did not retreat. No matter the situation, no matter the risk. There was a frightening consistency in the way he behaved in combat. While everything around was chaos, he was movement forward. And it was at this point that the war stopped being just a conflict and began to transform into something greater for those who were by his side. Because when a man refuses to stop, even when everything says he should, that changes how others see their own survival. Soldiers who were ready to give up found one last reserve of strength. Men who hesitated advanced, not because they did not feel fear, but because they saw someone who seemed to ignore it completely. And that created an effect impossible to measure, but impossible to deny. He did not just fight, he transformed those around him into something stronger than they were before. But war does not forgive, and no matter how strong someone is, there comes a moment when the body demands its price. Wounds began to appear, first small, then more serious. Each one of them, under normal conditions, would be enough to take any man out of combat. But with him, that was not how it worked. Because every time they took him out of the front line, something happened, something no one could fully explain. He came back, and he did not come back different. He did not come back more cautious. He did not come back slower. He came back exactly the same, advancing, as if the war had still not done enough to stop him. And this is where the story begins to move completely out of the ordinary. Because one thing is to fight well. Another thing is to survive. But to keep returning to the same hell repeatedly, even after being hit, that goes beyond any simple definition of courage. It enters a territory where logic no longer explains anything. And as this sequence of events began to build, as each new combat seemed more intense than the last, a question began to arise among those who witnessed it all up close. A simple question, but a disturbing one. How far is this man capable of going before the war finally manages to bring him down? Because up to that moment, it had not managed to. Before the sound of gunfire, before the smell of gunpowder, even before the war turned ordinary men into hardened survivors, there were already signs. Signs that he would not be just another name among thousands sent to the front. He did not emerge on the battlefield by chance. What he became there started long before. Even in his youth, there was something in the way he moved, in the way he competed, in the way he refused to accept defeat, that already drew attention. It was not just physical talent, although he had plenty. It was intensity. It was a kind of constant restlessness, as if standing still was impossible. While others rested, he trained. While others accepted limits, he tested how far he could go beyond them. And without realizing it, he was shaping exactly the kind of mindset that, years later, would be tested in the most brutal way possible. The environment around him did not make things easy. There were no privileges, no easy paths, no shortcuts. Everything he achieved came through direct effort, repetition, persistence. This built in him something that many only develop after a long time under pressure: mental resilience. The ability to keep going when there is no motivation left, when the body asks to stop, when everything feels harder than it should. This characteristic, invisible to many, would become one of the most important once the war began to demand its price. Because on the battlefield, physical strength has limits, technique has limits, but the mind, when trained the right way, can go far beyond what seems possible. And there was also leadership, not the kind taught in manuals nor built in classrooms. It was something natural. He did not need to raise his voice all the time, nor impose respect by force. People simply followed him because there was consistency between what he said and what he did. Because he never asked for something he was not willing to do first. And that, in any environment, is already powerful. But in a war scenario, it becomes decisive. Men do not follow words when they are under enemy fire. They follow trust. And trust is not built with speeches. It is built with example. When he joined the army, that combination began to take shape. Military training was not a shock. It was an adaptation. As if, in some way, all of that already made sense to him. Discipline, routine, physical demand, constant pressure. None of it broke him. On the contrary, it seemed to strengthen him. While some struggled to keep up, he moved forward with consistency. It was not just about completing tasks. It was about doing better, doing faster, going beyond the minimum required. And that quickly placed him in a different position. He was not just another recruit. He was someone who was beginning to stand out. With time, responsibility came. Becoming an officer did not just mean moving up in rank. It meant carrying lives in his decisions. Every order given, every movement planned, every advance or retreat. Everything had real consequences. And this is the point where many change. Many become more cautious, more distant, more concerned with preserving their own position. But with him, the opposite happened. The greater the responsibility, the closer he moved to the front line. Not out of recklessness, but because he understood something few truly understand. Leadership does not exist at a distance when the risk is real. And then the war stopped being a distant concept. It stopped being something you read in newspapers or hear in speeches. It became reality, an environment where there is no margin for error, where decisions are made in seconds, where every step could be the last. And it was exactly in that environment that everything he had built over the years began to fit together. Intensity became action. Resilience became survival. Leadership became something tangible, visible, undeniable. The first combats were not made of great stories. They were made of adaptation, of understanding the rhythm of war, of learning to read the battlefield, of recognizing patterns, of reacting under pressure. But even in those initial moments, there was already something different. He did not react like the others. Where there was hesitation, he saw opportunity. Where there was confusion, he found direction. And that began to create a contrast that became more and more evident. He was not just participating in the war, he was beginning to stand out within it. And that is how, step by step, combat after combat, that foundation built years before began to reveal its true value. Because war does not create men like him out of nothing. It only reveals who they truly are when everything around them collapses. And in that scenario where many fought just to survive, he was already starting to do something different. He was beginning to fight to win. The war finally revealed its true face when the scenario stopped being training and became survival. The dry heat, the uneven terrain, the constant dust in the air, and the feeling that danger could emerge from any direction marked the beginning of something much bigger. It was in this environment that he faced his first real tests. There was no longer room for theory. Every decision had to be fast, every movement had to be precise, and every mistake could cost lives. And it was exactly there, under real pressure, that something began to become evident to everyone around him. He did not just endure combat, he stood out within it. The first confrontations were nothing glorious. They were confusing, intense, unpredictable. The enemy did not appear clearly. Attacks came from hidden positions, and the tension never fully disappeared. But while many were still adapting, he was already acting with a confidence that did not seem natural for someone at that stage. It was not the absence of fear, it was control. It was the ability to act even with fear present, without letting it dominate every decision. And that made a huge difference in the field. Because when someone maintains clarity in the middle of chaos, he automatically becomes a point of reference for everyone else. It was during these combats that the first signs of something that would later become almost unbelievable began to appear. Situations where retreat seemed inevitable, but he advanced. Moments when the position seemed lost, but he reorganized the men and regained control. Small actions, isolated at first glance, but that began to accumulate, and each of them left the same impression. He simply did not react like the others. There was a calculated aggression in his decisions, a constant tendency to turn defense into attack, even when conditions did not favor it. And then came the wounds. The first impact is never just physical. There is shock, surprise, the breaking of the idea of invulnerability. Many men, when hit for the first time, change completely. They become more cautious, more withdrawn, more focused on surviving than advancing. But with him, it did not happen that way. Even wounded, he continued. Even in pain, he remained on the front line. And this began to generate something beyond respect. It began to generate disbelief, because it was not just a matter of resistance, it was repetition. He was hit and kept going. With each new confrontation, this characteristic became more evident. His body began to carry the marks of war, but his behavior remained the same. There was no emotional retreat. There was no change in posture. He continued leading the same way, advancing the same way, making decisions with the same intensity. And this created an almost psychological effect on those around him. Because when a man continues to act as if nothing can stop him, others begin to believe that as well. The battles intensified, the pressure increased, the enemy became more resistant, more organized, more prepared. And even so, there was something constant in that ever-changing scenario. He continued to be the first to advance. He continued to be the point of decision. He continued to be the one who, even under fire, found a way to turn the situation around. Not because he was invincible, but because he refused to act like someone who could be defeated. And it was exactly at this point that the perception around him began to change definitively. He stopped being just a good officer. He stopped being just a reliable leader. He began to become something different, something the men could not fully explain, but could feel. A presence that increased confidence, a reference point in moments of chaos, someone who seemed to operate on a different level when the situation became critical. But the war was still far from showing everything it had prepared. Because up to that moment, he had not yet faced the worst. He had not yet been placed in situations that went beyond any physical or mental limit. He had not yet been tested to the point of breaking or proving definitively that he would not break. And that moment was getting closer. Europe was in flames. And what came next was not just another battle, it was the turning point of the entire war. For years, the Allied forces knew that moment would come. But when it finally did, there was no room for error. The fate of millions depended on a single move, a single advance, a single decision to invade occupied Europe. And when the doors of that operation opened, there was no turning back. It was advance, or lose everything. The sound began even before any soldier touched the ground. Aircraft cutting through the sky, ships slicing across the sea, distant explosions preparing the terrain. It was a massive mobilization, something the world had never seen before. Thousands of men being launched toward heavily defended territory where the enemy was already waiting, entrenched, prepared to turn every meter into a field of death. And even so, they went. Among them was that officer who was already beginning to be seen differently by those who fought beside him. As the landing crafts approached the coast, reality became impossible to ignore. The sea hitting against the sides, the weight of the equipment, the tense silence broken only by short commands and looks that said everything without needing words. No one there was naive. Everyone knew exactly what was about to happen. The moment the ramp dropped, everything would change. And when it finally did, the world exploded into chaos. Enemy machine guns opened fire, bullets tearing through the air, water being hit all around, men falling before even reaching the sand. The first contact was not just difficult, it was brutal. There was not enough cover. There was no time to organize perfect formations. It was run, duck, advance, survive. And in the middle of all that, while many tried to find any kind of shelter, there was someone doing the exact opposite. He was advancing. It was not recklessness. It was decision. He knew that standing still meant death. He knew that hesitation meant losing ground. And in that kind of scenario, every second mattered. So he did what he had done before. He put himself at the front. He led the advance even under direct fire, reorganized men who were disoriented, turned desperation into movement. And that, in that specific moment, made all the difference. Because when one group starts to move forward, others follow. And suddenly, the impossible begins to look possible. As the Allied forces managed to establish a foothold on the beach, the next challenge appeared immediately. It was not enough to arrive. It was necessary to push inland. And that meant facing terrain that completely favored the enemy. Barriers, obstacles, elevated positions, prepared defensive lines. Every step forward was contested. Every advance demanded maximum effort. And it was in that scenario that he once again did what was becoming his signature. He did not wait for the perfect opportunity. He created the opportunity. There was a specific moment when the situation seemed about to collapse. Heavy fire, strong resistance, difficulty progressing. Any rational analysis would suggest retreat, reorganization, waiting for support. But he did not follow that path. He found a weapon available and decided to act. He advanced, exposed himself to direct danger, moved closer to the enemy than anyone would recommend, and completely changed the course of that confrontation. It was not luck. It was not chance. It was decision under extreme pressure. But war always demands a price. And on that same day, his body began to feel it in a brutal way. One impact, then another. Pain, difficulty moving, the kind of situation that normally ends any soldier's participation. Evacuation was the logical option. Withdrawal was the expected path. But once again, he refused. Because as long as there were men under his command still in combat, he would not leave. Even wounded, he continued leading. Even with physical limitations, he maintained the advance. And that did not just influence the immediate result of that battle, it consolidated something that had already been building for some time. The perception that he did not operate within normal limits. That there was something different in the way he faced war. Something that could not be easily explained, but could be clearly seen. And in that moment, as the advance continued and chaos still dominated the battlefield, one thing was already certain for those around him. If there was someone capable of going through all of that, it was him. But the worst was still yet to come. After the beaches were no longer the only hell, the war revealed a new kind of difficulty. Slower, suffocating, more treacherous. The advance into the interior of France was not fought in open fields where the enemy could be clearly seen. It was a maze, a closed, irregular terrain surrounded by natural walls of earth and vegetation that hid danger just a few meters away. Every path looked the same. Every turn could be an ambush. And there was no easy advance. There was only constant confrontation. The hedgerows transformed the battlefield into something completely different. Limited lines of sight, difficult communication, restricted movement. The enemy did not need to appear. He only needed to wait. Machine guns positioned strategically. Soldiers hidden. Crossfire coming from unexpected directions. It was the kind of environment that broke rhythm, that disorganized units, that created confusion even among the most experienced. And it was exactly in that environment that he chose to do the opposite of what was expected. While many advanced with extreme caution, he kept applying pressure. Not in a reckless way, but with an aggression that seemed to ignore the pattern of that war. He understood something that few were able to apply at that moment. In that kind of terrain, hesitation often meant giving time to the enemy, and giving time to the enemy meant losing initiative. So he forced the pace. He advanced before the other side was ready. He attacked positions that seemed too secure to be challenged, and that began to generate results. There were situations where his own patrols became pinned under intense fire, just a few meters from the enemy, unable to advance or retreat. The kind of moment where silence mixes with the constant noise of gunfire, where every second feels longer than the last. And in those moments, he did not stay back coordinating from a distance. He moved forward. He entered the same space of risk as his men, assessed the situation up close, and acted. Not with words, with direct action. Grenades, quick movements, decisions made in fractions of a second. He moved toward danger instead of away from it. And that created something almost impossible to ignore. Because when an officer does that repeatedly, when he places himself exactly where the risk is highest, it completely changes the dynamic of the group. The fear is still there, but it loses strength because there is someone showing, in practice, that it is possible to advance even under maximum pressure. But the enemy adapted. Positions became stronger. Fire became more precise. Responses became faster. And in one of those moments, while moving forward to help men pinned under attack, he was hit. A direct, violent, unexpected impact. The kind of wound that does not just interrupt movement, but threatens everything. The body reacts, balance is lost, consciousness wavers. And in that instant, in any other scenario, it would end right there. But it did not. Even with the severity of the wound, even with the difficulty to remain conscious, he refused to leave. The situation was not resolved yet. His men were still at risk. And as long as that was true, he would stay. Not because it was easy, not because there was no pain, but because, for him, leaving at that moment was not an option. And then something even more impressive happened. Even unable to speak normally, even with clear physical limitations, he continued guiding, continued indicating directions, continued being the point of reference in the middle of chaos. Not with long speeches, but with presence, with action, with decision. And that was enough. Enough to reorganize the situation, enough to maintain the advance, enough to turn a critical moment into something controllable. When the position was finally secured, when the immediate objective was achieved, only then did he allow them to remove him. Not before. Never before. And that left a mark that went beyond that specific combat. Because it was not just another story of bravery, it was another proof of a pattern that could no longer be ignored. He did not just face extreme situations, he functioned inside them. And at that point in the war, between closed fields, intense combat, and decisions made in seconds, one thing was already clear to everyone there. He was not just someone hard to bring down. He was beginning to look impossible to stop. At this point, the war was no longer a sequence of isolated battles. It had become a constant pressure, a continuous state of physical and mental exhaustion, where every advance came at a cost and every mistake could be final. But it was exactly in this scenario, where most men were already operating at their limit, that he began to do something that went beyond any expectation, because fighting well was no longer enough. Surviving was no longer enough. He was starting to do things that simply should not happen. The terrain remained hostile. Enemy positions were better organized, supported by heavy firepower, with defensive lines prepared to resist any direct attempt of advance. And it was in this type of situation that the most unlikely confrontations emerged. Moments where military theory pointed to extreme caution, waiting for reinforcement, detailed planning. But reality did not offer that time. Pressure demanded immediate action, and once again, he was the first to move. There was a critical point where the advance simply stopped. The enemy had positioned armored vehicles strategically, completely blocking progress. The fire was heavy, constant, impossible to ignore. Any direct attempt seemed suicidal. The men were trapped. No room for maneuver, no sufficient cover, no clear alternative. It was the kind of situation that freezes entire units, but not him. Without hesitation, he identified a possibility, not a perfect opportunity, just a chance. And that was enough. He picked up a weapon that was not even part of his standard equipment, a weapon that required proximity, precision, and absolute nerve. And he advanced. There was no guarantee of success. There was no margin for error. Every step placed him closer to absolute danger, but he kept going. The first shot changed everything. A direct hit, a moment of rupture, the kind of action that breaks the enemy's confidence and gives momentum back to his side. But it did not stop there. He kept pressing forward, kept advancing, kept transforming a stalled situation into something dynamic. And when it was over, what had seemed like an impossible blockade had been overcome. But war never responds passively. The reaction came, and it came hard. An immediate counterattack, heavy, trying to regain control, trying to restore the advantage. And it was at that moment that he was hit again. A more serious impact, more aggressive, the kind of wound that normally ends any immediate participation in combat. The body reacts, mobility decreases, the pain intensifies, and once again, a decision had to be made. Withdraw or continue. And once again, he chose to continue. Even with his body compromised, even with every movement demanding extreme effort, he remained, not just present, but active. He continued coordinating, continued encouraging, continued being the point of stability for those around him, and that had an immediate effect. Because when someone in that condition is still fighting, no one wants to be the first to stop. The men began to respond. The advance resumed. The line reorganized. And what could have turned into a forced retreat became another position secured. Not without cost, never without cost, but with results. And in that moment, something changed permanently, because it was no longer just a sequence of impressive actions. It was no longer just a repetition of courage under pressure. It was a pattern that could no longer be ignored. He was being hit repeatedly and still coming back, still leading, still advancing as if the war had not yet found a way to stop him. And that began to create a feeling difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. For some, he was simply an exceptional leader. For others, something more. Something that seemed to operate beyond normal limits. Not invincible, but dangerously close to it. Because at that point in the war, after everything that had already happened, one question began to arise stronger than ever. How many times can a man be hit before he finally falls? And the answer had not yet come. There comes a moment in every war when luck stops being a factor, and simply surviving already feels like a miracle. And for him, that moment had been surpassed long ago. His body carried enough marks to take any man out of combat. Logic no longer supported his presence there. And still, he continued. But what was coming next was not just another test. It was the kind of situation that leaves no margin for resistance, no space to continue, no alternative but to fall. The advance continued under constant pressure. The terrain remained treacherous, enemy positions harder and harder to break, and the accumulated exhaustion was beginning to affect everyone around. There was no rest, no pause. It was continuous movement inside an environment where any mistake could be fatal. And it was in that scenario that everything changed in a matter of seconds. A direct impact, violent, unexpected, not a distant shot, but a brutal force hitting him head-on. The explosion was immediate, the kind of impact that knocks the air out of you, that disorients, that makes the world disappear for a moment. The body is thrown, balance is lost, and everything turns into noise and emptiness at the same time. For any other man, that would have been the end. There was no way to absorb that and continue. There was no way to simply get up and move forward. The war, finally, had reached its limit, and for a few moments, it seemed like it had succeeded. Silence, confusion. The battlefield continued around, but for him, everything became distant. His body did not respond the same way. His consciousness wavered. The kind of situation where the line between staying and disappearing begins to fade. And around him, the men saw it. They saw the impact. They saw his condition, and they knew exactly what it meant. But then, something happened. It was not immediate. It was not simple. It was not easy. But against all expectations, there was movement. Small at first, almost imperceptible, but real. And then another and another, until what seemed impossible began to become visible. He was still there, still conscious, still present, and more than that, still trying to come back. The pain had not disappeared. The damage had not decreased. His body was not ready, but the decision had already been made before logic could interfere. Because for him, it was not over yet. As long as there was combat happening, as long as his men were still at risk, he did not consider that the end. What came next was not an immediate return to combat. It was something even more impressive. It was the refusal to accept his current state as final. It was the insistence on remaining connected to the battle, even when his body clearly could not keep up. Directions, gestures, presence. Small signs that, despite everything, he was still there, still trying to lead, still trying to maintain control of a situation that had already gone beyond any reasonable physical limit. And that had an immediate effect on those around him. Because when someone survives something they should not, it completely changes how others perceive the situation. Fear does not disappear, but it loses strength. Doubt still exists, but it decreases, because there is a concrete proof right there in front of them that even the worst scenario is not enough to end everything. But the truth is that in that moment, something had been pushed to the absolute limit. The body could no longer continue at that pace. The war had finally demanded a price that could not be ignored. And this time, there was no choice. He would have to leave. And when that happened, it was not like before. It was not a short pause. It was not a temporary withdrawal with an immediate return. It was different. It was more serious. It was deeper. For the first time, there was a real sense that this could be the end of his presence on that battlefield. But even so, something remained, a silent expectation, because up to that moment, every time it seemed like the end, he came back. The hospital was supposed to be the end of the line, a place of forced pause, of slow recovery, of definitive distance from the chaos. Wounded bodies, men trying to rebuild what the war had destroyed, doctors doing everything possible to keep each one there, away from the front. And for the first time in a long time, he was in that environment. Far from the gunfire, far from the explosions, far from the front line. At least, that was what everyone expected. Because for any other man, that would have been the natural conclusion. The accumulated wounds, the recent impact, the compromised physical condition, everything pointed in the same direction. Stay. Recover. Accept that his part was finished, and no one would judge him for that. No one would expect anything more. In fact, just being alive would already be considered enough. But there was a problem. He did not think that way. As the days passed, as his body slowly began to respond, as the distance from the battlefield created a strange kind of silence, something inside him did not settle. It was not relief. It was not rest. It was restlessness. Because somewhere beyond those walls, the war continued. His men were still advancing. Decisions were still being made. And he was not there. And for him, that was unacceptable. The idea of staying there, waiting, while everything happened without his presence, did not make sense. It did not align with everything he had done up to that point. It did not match the way he had faced every situation. And so, a decision began to take shape. Not impulsive, not emotional, but inevitable. He needed to go back. Not when he was fully recovered. Not when he was ready according to medical standards, but now, the way he was. Because for him, being partially functional was still better than not being present. And that was how something that should not happen, happened. He left. Not with formal authorization, not following expected protocol, but with one clear objective: return to combat. The path back was not simple. His body still carried limitations. Mobility was not the same. The pain was still there. But none of that was enough to change the decision. Every step, every movement, every effort, all pointed in the same direction. Back to where he believed he needed to be. And when he finally arrived, the impact was immediate. The men did not expect to see him. For many, he was already out. He had already done his part. He had already been removed from the equation. And suddenly, he was there again, standing, present, ready to take the place he had never stopped considering his. And that did something no order could do. It lifted men who were exhausted. It reorganized groups that were disoriented. It restored confidence where doubt had already begun to take over. Because it was not just about him being back, it was about what that represented. If someone in that condition was still willing to return, then no one there had an excuse to step back. And once again, he did what he always did. He took leadership. He moved forward. He reorganized the line. He turned an unstable scenario into something functional. Not because he was in his best physical condition, but because his presence alone was already a decisive factor. And it was in that moment that everything reached another level, because it was no longer just about physical resistance. It was no longer just about courage in combat. It was something deeper. It was a complete refusal to accept limits imposed by the situation. A mindset that did not recognize the moment to stop, only the moment to continue. And that left a permanent mark, because now it was no longer just a sequence of impressive episodes. It was a story that could no longer be ignored, a pattern that could no longer be explained with simple words. He had been hit. He had been removed. He had been considered out of the war. And even so, he came back. And when someone does that, when someone challenges not only the enemy, but also his own physical condition, it changes everything. Because at that point, the question was no longer whether he would fall. The question now was, if anything would truly be capable of stopping him. The war ended. The noise faded. The advance stopped. The fields that had once been dominated by explosions and screams gave way to a silence that, for many, was difficult to understand. Because surviving the war did not just mean being alive, it meant learning how to exist without it. And for men like him, that was never simple. The return home did not come with the same impact as the battles. There were no immediate celebrations, no crowds recognizing every action, no proportionate acknowledgement of what had truly happened. Like so many others, he returned and moved on. He rebuilt his life, found a new purpose, continued to lead, now far from the battlefield. But something important had been left behind, not by choice, but by mistake. During the war, a formal recognition had been made, a record, a recommendation, something that should have placed his name among the greatest examples of courage in military history. But that recommendation was lost. Literally, a document that was never processed, a decision that was never finalized, a recognition that never came. And so, for years, everything remained in silence. 36 years. 36 years in which that story existed only among those who had been there, among those who had seen, among those who knew. But outside that circle, almost no one knew. The man who had faced impossible situations, who had been hit multiple times, who had returned to combat when he should not have, simply lived his life as just another veteran among many. But stories like this do not disappear completely. They remain, they circulate. They are told in fragments, remembered in conversations, preserved by those who were present. And it was exactly that which, years later, brought everything back to the surface. An investigation, a simple question, an effort to understand if something had been left behind. And it had. The error was identified. The failure was recognized. And finally, after decades, what should have happened long before happened. The recognition arrived. His name was officially placed where it had always belonged, and those words, delayed for so long, were finally spoken. But by that point, the medal was no longer the most important thing, because what he did not depend on recognition to exist. It did not depend on ceremony to have value. It did not depend on external approval to be real. Those who had stood beside him already knew. Those who had seen what happened had no doubts. And maybe that is exactly what makes this story different. It is not just about a man who fought well. It is not just about an officer who led under pressure. It is about someone who went beyond what seemed possible, repeatedly, in an environment where every mistake could be the last. Someone who did not just face the war, but kept advancing within it, even when everything said he should stop. And when everything was over, when time passed, when the world moved on, what remained was not just a sequence of impressive events. It was an example, a standard, something that is not measured only in victories or defeats, but in the way someone chooses to act when they are at the limit. Because in the end, that is what defines everything. Not how many times someone is tested, but how many times he chooses to keep going, even when he no longer should.